My name is Becca, and wherever you are joining us from, you are really welcome. Hello to those who are on Facebook. Hello those who are on YouTube. Feel free to say hello in the comment section and let us know where you're from this evening. There are loads of people here from different parts of Hampshire, from Southampton, and maybe even further afield. So please do say hello in the comments. We see all of them, and let us know where you are joining from. Also, the amazing thing about being live streaming on Facebook and YouTube is that you can share. So if you share this link, be that on your Facebook page or with your friends, everyone can join directly to it and watch along with us. So it would be great if you can do to share that on your social media. That would be amazing. We're really pleased to have Chris Sinkinson with us this evening as we think about archaeology and biblical events. Now, just before we get started with that, a little bit about us. We are Southampton Lighthouse International Church. We are a diverse church with brilliant people from all around the world, with a specific mission to reach out to those from other faith backgrounds. If you aren't already from a church background, you may already be part of a church, and that's amazing. But if you aren't already part of a church, you're really welcome to say hello. We meet every Sunday at 10:30, and it would be so cool if you came and joined us if you'd like to. The details are all on the church website, Southampton Lighthouse. So please feel free to come join us. They're coming across the screen. We'd love to see you. Now on to tonight's event. Chris is going to speak to us for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to have time for a question and answer session. Now, throughout the time, if you could please write your questions onto the comment section of YouTube on Facebook, and we can see them. Chris won't answer them at the exact minute, but at the end, we will be asking him some questions for him to answer. Now, we'll try and get through as many as possible, but it might be that a question is going to be addressed next week, or we'll have time to do it the week after. So please don't worry if your question's not been answered. But please get posting. You can post at any point. If you post a question at the start, we will look at them at the end. So please feel free to post as they come through with you. Thank you so much for those who are already saying where they're from. It's really exciting to see so many different people from around. Great to see you. So I'm really looking forward to it. As I say, put the questions in the chat. I'm now going to hand over to John Simmons, who is also part of our church, who is going to tell us a bit more about Chris and introduce him tonight. So over to you, John.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited about this evening. We've got lots of people we've known for years joining in, and I'm thrilled with that. But I would like to introduce Chris to you. Chris Sinkinson. This is a special joy for me because actually I've known Chris, I think, for probably about 30 years or so. He turned up as a student at the church where I was pastor here in Southampton, and was a great joy to us as a church. He was very enthusiastic and zealous. I had the joy of baptizing him. I had the joy of seeing him fall in love with his beautiful wife. And I've also followed him from a distance as he did a master's in biblical studies and then a PhD in Bristol in theology. He was pastor of a church here in the New Forest area. And God greatly blessed that church in a village. It expanded. The church had to have additional space built onto it, became the social center of the village, actually. And then, of course, he's moved on to Moorlands Bible College, where I'm not sure if that's the correct name of that now, Chris. He'll correct me. But increasingly, of course, Chris has a national and even an international ministry based at Moorlands. He is a very enthusiastic amateur archaeologist. And of course, this talk is about the Bible and archaeology, digging for the truth. So before I hand over to Chris, I'd just like to pray for God's blessing on this meeting. If you feel free, join me in prayer now. Heavenly Father, you have exalted the Lord Jesus Christ to the highest position in the universe, and he's also head of the church, his body. Heavenly Father, I personally, along with the older generation of Christians, want to say thank you for raising up a new generation of Christian leaders, among whom is our dear brother Chris Sinkinson. We ask Tonight, the Spirit of God will be upon Chris, that you'll use him powerfully, help each of us to grasp hold of the message he's bringing across. And we just want to pray that to each one of us, we'll grow in our understanding of the truth of the Christian faith, where archaeology backs up the words of the Bible. So we ask your blessing on this meeting in Jesus' name. Amen. And with that, I have the joy of handing over to Chris Sinkinson.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. I thank you so much for that introduction. That's a real kind of bigging me up, really. And I hope that these talks are going to be really helpful for whoever you are tuning in tonight and following what I've got to share. Originally, I was going to be here in person. And of course, being in person, I would have wanted to bring along some objects to share with you. I love archaeology and always have done. And there's something about the physical, tangible nature of being able to see an object, to be able to hold an object, which connects us back to the past. Well, I can't share with you any objects this evening, but I can share with you some pictures. So I'm going to be using my keynote slides. So I've got some pictures to share with you. And I'm doing this week and next week. So tonight, we're going to go back into the world of archaeology, look at some of its origins, where it comes from, what it is, some of its limitations as well. And I'm going to focus on the Old Testament this evening. So the story of the Bible up to the time of Jesus. And then next week, I'm going to save all the Gospels material, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And next week, we'll have a look at the material that surrounds the life of Jesus from archaeology. So that's our plan. So perhaps bear with me for 2 weeks to really get into this material. But I do get very passionate about this. And so to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes this evening is going to be holding back a lot of material I'd like to share. Depends where your questions go, maybe. But I am holding back a lot that I'd really like to share with you. And part of that comes out of this wonderful part of the world, the land of Israel or Canaan, whatever you want to call it, this wonderful part of the world that is so steeped in history that you really can't walk very far at all without coming across something that tells you about the ancient world. If my slides are working, you're going to see on the screen an image of the part of the world we're going to go to this evening. So you can forget about the cold weather and the rain that we're experiencing, because we're heading out to the Holy Land. And you can see the satellite view there, of course, the Sea of Galilee in the north and the Dead Sea down in the south. And this is part of what we call the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent stretches from Egypt right across through where Canaan is, down through Mesopotamia. And the Fertile Crescent, this kind of crescent shape area of land, is sometimes called the Cradle of Civilization. Because wherever you go here, you find the earliest beginnings of civilization, whether we talk about agriculture, which would have been in Sumeria, whether we're talking about maths and literature in Babylon, Assyria, whether we're talking about writing and systems of writing, bronze, the discovery of metallurgy, the creation of bronze, iron and the development of the Iron Age. All of these things begin in the Fertile Crescent and spread from there. And this is the land of the Bible. And so tonight we can tap into what is a remarkable combination of the history, the archaeology, and the Bible, the biblical story. The two come together. They belong together here. You can explore history and archaeology and at the same time be exploring the world of the Bible. And that really is helpful as a reminder that when we look at the history of archaeology and what archaeology is, as a science, it developed in this part of the world. It developed in the land of Canaan and in its surroundings in the Fertile Crescent. So you have this coming together, this beautiful coming together of a new discipline, relatively new. It's only really 100 or so years old as we understand archaeology, a relatively new discipline, and the land of the Bible. And that's why I've got so much I want to share with you. I mean, I genuinely could spend several hours now talking about different finds and discoveries that help us to confirm the Bible. Of course, I'm going to hold back, so I'm not going to be sharing all of those things. But what I do share, you'll see, emerged because of the interest that those pioneers of archaeology had in the Holy Land. So let's take a trip back to the Holy Land, and here's a little bit of history for you. First of all, the patron saint of archaeologists is Saint Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine. And we're really going back now to the 4th century. And Helena, when her son supposedly became a Christian, I'm not going to go into that story right now, whether he did or not, but when when Constantine claimed to have become a Christian, we begin the Holy Roman Empire, his mother Constantine had a passion, his mother Helena, I should say, had a passion to try to recover the places associated with the life of Jesus. And so Helena, with a detachment of Roman troops, headed off to the Holy Land to excavate and built churches to commemorate locations associated with the life and the death and the ministry of Jesus. You can see on the screen the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. I'm sure many of you have been to Bethlehem and visited the site of the church, and what a mess it is. These old churches are an incredible mess in architectural terms, because it goes back to the 4th century when this church was built over the supposed site of the Nativity, the birth of Jesus. There's a similar church in terms of its history called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which marks the site of the death and resurrection of Jesus. We'll talk about that one next week. But they are an incredible mess architecturally, because for 1600 years there's been destruction and rebuilding and development to create the church that we have today, which is from an archaeological point of view incredibly interesting. From a kind of spiritual point of view, it can be very confusing. These churches can seem very noisy and chaotic and disconnected to what we want to learn in terms of the biblical story. But the interesting thing about these locations is that from an archaeological point of view, there is actually a lot of authenticity to them, surprisingly. Helena knew where to dig, knew where to excavate, and when she had churches built here to commemorate these places, it was built on local knowledge. And that suggests that she may not have been far off in terms of where these buildings were sited. However, is this really archaeology? Helena was really trying to find relics for the Christian faith. And she did. She found relics. She discovered all sorts of things that she claimed were relics from the time of Jesus. In fact, at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where the crucifixion supposedly took place, she claimed, shards of the Holy Cross that Jesus had been crucified on. And of course, these would have been cut up and sent around the Mediterranean world and stored in churches. And by the time you get to the Reformation, the time of Martin Luther and John Calvin, the joke going around by Martin Luther is that if you reassembled all these fragments of the cross, you'd have enough crosses to crucify a Roman legion. In other words, the relics multiplied. And that's why this isn't really archaeology. What Helena was trying to do in her pious way was to prove the Christian faith and to find relics that connected her to Jesus. Now, maybe that has its place. I'm not so sure. Maybe it does. But it's not archaeology. And that's what I just want to move on to. What is the difference then as we move from Helena to the more modern world of archaeology? And by the way, another point about Helena, not only the patron saint of archaeologists, she's also the patron saint of difficult marriages. I'm not quite sure why those two go together, but that's a quirk of history. I took a funeral a few years ago at Canford Magna near Wimborne. And at the church at Canford Magna, if you come out the door, the little church building there, you'll see the graves, and there right in front of you is this particular tomb with the inscription, Sir Henry Austin Layard, the discoverer of Nineveh. And he was a member of Parliament. Now, Layard in the 19th century, 1800s, brings us much more into the world of what we will call archaeology. And Layard is a pioneer of archaeology in the Fertile Crescent. Though again, it's not really archaeology as we're going to know it, But nonetheless, what did Layard do? Layard remarkably went to what we would modern day Iraq, of course, what we know as Mesopotamia, and he excavated the lost city of Nineveh. He discovered Nineveh. And in the ruins of Nineveh, he found these fabulous sculptures and wall reliefs. If you visited the British Museum, absolutely fabulous galleries at the British Museum that display the discoveries of Austin Henry Layard, including these enormous human-headed winged bull creatures. They're called lamassu, which guarded the palaces. We now know actually that Layard had discovered even more than Nineveh. He thought he'd found Nineveh, the city associated with Jonah, but actually he'd found several Assyrian cities. He thought they were one city, and these come from Nimrod as well as from Nineveh. But these discoveries Layard made in the Victorian period were electrifying. His book sold incredibly well. So before I move on in my slides, his book sold incredibly well, became very well known, became an MP, as I say, and a custodian of the British Museum, where many of these wonderful discoveries were housed. And he rekindled an interest in the historicity of the Bible. He became good friends of a man called Charles Spurgeon, a great Victorian preacher in London, who happened to be in his constituency in London. And that kind of friendship also reflected this new rediscovery, if you like, of the historicity of the Bible. And so other Victorian pioneers would include Charles Warren. Charles Warren, in, again, the 19th century, was stationed out in Jerusalem with the military. He was doing map making and as part of the Ordnance Survey. And in his map making work, he carried out some precision exploration of tunnels and chambers underneath the site of where the Temple of Solomon once stood. Nowadays, it's the great Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. And this location, so prized by Christians and Jews and Muslims for centuries, was explored by Charles Warren using scientific skills that he'd learned originally in the military, but actually mapping the Rock of Gibraltar. That was his first task as a man in his young 20s. And then when he was posted out to Jerusalem, he did this incredible map making. He discovered tunnels and cisterns, and he made connections to the biblical record. Charles Warren realized that one particular tunnel he found seemed to connect to the entrance that David and his men used in the Old Testament as a way of sneaking into the city of Jerusalem. It's nowadays called Warren's Shaft. We still name it after him. And it's a secret shaft that leads down to a hidden water source. We're not so sure nowadays that this is actually the shaft that was used by David's men, but quite possibly. And certainly it was in use at that time and would have provided a secret entrance into the city. So again, another pioneer of this period. But what you notice with Charles Warren is he was bringing together more scientific precision with a love of the Bible and a love of the land. Warren's expertise would mean that when he returned to London, he became the head of the Metropolitan Police, and he was the commissioner in charge in the hunt for Jack the Ripper. Unsuccessful, and he got into quite a bit of trouble for failing with that particular investigation that was going on in London. But nonetheless, in terms of archaeology, this is pioneering work, and yet there's still a problem. There is still something missing in terms of what we mean by archaeology. And what is that missing element? Well, let me give you a little bit of testimony to tell you what that missing element is. You see, I fell in love with archaeology long before I became a Christian. And you may guess because of my age what this might lead to. It was about 1983, 84. And of course, on the big screen at the time, not Lara Croft actually, but Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And that for me was archaeology. And so inspired by this kind of film and story, I got interested in the world of archaeology. In fact, originally I was going to study archaeology at Southampton University. In my first year at Southampton, I ended up changing courses. Apologies to anybody at Southampton University, but I studied something else. And I ended up doing theology, partly because I realized archaeology was incredibly hard work. And it was spending a lot of Saturdays outdoors in the pouring rain in wet English fields. It had very little to do with the treasure hunting of something like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Lara Croft and Tomb Raider. And you see, what those films and stories reflect, and most of us love that kind of thing, is treasure hunting. The desire to find something shiny, something that proves a point. And really, it's at this point in the late 1800s that we see a parting of the ways. Archaeology becomes a more disciplined science. It's less about trying to find things and prove things. It's more about trying to understand the ancient world. And that really becomes the story of archaeology in the 20th century. So, by the way, if you're ever watching any of the Indiana Jones films anytime soon, just notice scene after scene after scene how it would be bad practice in archaeology. Indiana Jones would be out of a job because in terms of the disciplines and the painstaking methodology of archaeology, Indiana Jones is much more of an adventure action hero than what would count as an archaeologist. And so our story moves on. And I want to just tell you another great figure. Now we're going to begin to see some material emerging that is astonishing in terms of casting light on the text of the Bible. And I want to start with a man called Flinders Petri. Petri's British archaeologist. The name sounds French, but British archaeologist. And he pioneered in terms of the method of archaeology, an approach which took into account one really important factor with archaeology. And that is that archaeology is not about trying to prove something. It's about trying to understand something. And in order to understand the ancient world, you need to pay attention and take care of the details. The tiniest details matter. It doesn't have to be the gold, shiny, fabulous jewelry or sculptures that people had prized before. When I shared with you those pictures of Henry Austin Layard and those beautiful sculptures, which you can see today in the British Museum, archaeologists don't excavate that way anymore. What Layard had done was to dig holes to find things, destroying things along the way, and take those things back to London. Petri began an approach to archaeology that would emphasize slow and careful and sometimes painful methodology. He wanted to see the details. He analysed the pottery. He analysed the finds. Let me tell you one anecdote about Flinders Petri, a little detail about an excavation in Egypt, which actually changed the nature of archaeology. Petri was excavating in Egypt. He would go on to what was called Palestine at that time as well, and excavate in Samaria. He'd been involved in Israel, modern-day Israel. But in Egypt, on one particular excavation, Petri noticed something very strange. They would hire local workers for $1 a day or equivalent. For minimal money, the local workers would dig in the hot, dry sands of Egypt to see what they could find. And Petri noticed that on these digs and excavations, they would find walls and pillars and columns and large statues. They would make impressive discoveries. But something was missing. What they wouldn't find were the small items, the coins or little statuettes or maybe jewelry or maybe amulets or little scarabs or cylinder seals. These just weren't appearing. But while the archaeology was going on, and people like Petri and the other organizers would be sitting under their umbrellas in the hot desert sun, on the black market down the road in the local town, the bazaar would be full of new artifacts coming on the market. And people would buy these artifacts and sell these artifacts, and locals would be making money. And Petri realized, of course, what was going on, that as his laborers were working away in the dry heat for minimal wage, when they found something interesting, they'd put it in their pocket and it would be later sold on the black market. Now, Petri realized here was the problem. They weren't getting the information because the locals were just using it as treasure hunting. And what he did is he called his laborers before him and he did a deal with them. He said, I will pay you your $1 a day to work in the desert sun as laborers, but at the end of the day, you bring me anything you found and I will pay you the market rate for anything you find. And that changed everything. Then they would bring to him these items they were finding, these beautiful little detailed items that gave him information. Now, he was paying for them. So it wasn't as if Petri was treasure hunting. Petri wanted the information value. And it's this that began to put archaeology on a different footing, archaeology becoming less about treasure hunting and more about a science. And that's one of the reasons why Petri made the find of his lifetime, which is very significant for biblical studies. It was in Egypt, and Petri discovered this stela. Now, a stela is a monumental standing stone. Just think of it like a gravestone. Some of them, like this one, larger than any gravestone you'd see, but often they're about the size of a normal gravestone. And a stela would maybe stand at a city gate. It would be a monument, but it would have all sorts of information on it, maybe praising the local king or chieftain or the local god that was being worshipped. Now, this particular stela is called the Merneptah stela because it's a declaration of the great victories of a pharaoh from 1200 BC. So this is a 3,200-year-old stela. It's beautiful. It's engraved very clearly with these Egyptian hieroglyphs. And because hieroglyphs were already understood, in other words, by the time of the Rosetta Stone that you may have heard of had been found, hieroglyphs were understood as Petri even removed the sand. He could read on here an inscription of an account of Pharaoh Merneptah and his military expeditions in the local area. And what he discovered was astonishing, and he knew it straight away. He knew straight away this was the find of his lifetime. What he found is a reference, and this is the earliest reference found anywhere in the world to Israel. Israel in Canaan, referred to in 1200 BC. Now on the screen you can see it's highlighted here, the particular hieroglyphs you want to see, and it goes right to left, and it's a reference to Israel. That's how it would sound in Egyptian. And remarkably, if you look on the left, I don't know how clear this is on your screen, depends what kind of device you're using maybe. If you're looking at a phone, then this might be quite hard. But if the screen's large enough, you might be able to just see this. If you follow the hieroglyphs along from right to left, on the left-hand side, there's actually two figures sort of kneeling there, and underneath 3 little lines, 1, 2, 3 lines underneath. And what that's telling you is that Israel, that's referred to on this stela, is a group of people, not a place. Now, what he had found in 1200 BC is a reference to Merneptah traveling all around the area. There are references to lots of places. And places are referred to as cities sometimes, as a hieroglyph for a city. Sometimes they're a landscape, a region, and there's another hieroglyph to mean a region. But with Israel, it uses the particular hieroglyphs to refer to a group of people and not a place. And so Merneptah is telling us that when he went into Canaan, he found a people group, a people called Israel, and they must have been terrible enemies to the Egyptians. In fact, to the Egyptians, these must have been people they were deeply hostile to, because it says that he wiped them out. It says their seed is no more. They've been completely destroyed. Now, of course, Israel were not completely destroyed. We know Israel 3,000 years on still makes the evening news. Pharaoh Merneptah is largely forgotten. It's propaganda. He didn't do it. But what a remarkable thing that in this piece of propaganda, we have the earliest reference to Israel. Israel in the land of Canaan, we call Israel. Israel as a people group, and Israel being considered enemies of the Empire of Egypt. And this is a discovery of Flinders Petri. And it's remarkable because it brings Israel and the story of Israel from the Bible into this world of archaeological discovery. And so we can move on. And I just want to mention one other archaeologist before I move on to another aspect of archaeology in the Holy Land, and that's Kathleen Kenyon. I just want to draw attention to her for a moment. She's a fierce-looking woman there on the screen, and she was a fierce and formidable woman. She was involved in one of the first all-female archaeological teams to Zimbabwe in the 1920s. She was a remarkable thing, this, 1920s, team of female archaeologists, and she organised all of the logistics. She had to drive the car, deal with the tents, negotiate with the locals. These were formidable people, these pioneers of archaeology. And Kathleen Kenyon excavated in the Holy Land as well. You've got on the screen there a picture of Jericho. Some of the discoveries that she made are now debated in terms of the dating. There's an issue of the dating of Jericho that she was involved in. But I do just want to draw attention to her because she kind of brings this story more up to date in terms of what archaeology is. Kenyon was very happy to criticize the biblical record. She did not have a problem with saying the Bible could be wrong. All she was interested in was archaeology as a scientific discipline. And what does it tell us? And I want to draw attention to that because the material of archaeology is remarkable, not for proving the Bible. And I always hesitate with using that language of proving the Bible. What archaeology really does is it demonstrates that wherever we can test the Bible, it shows itself as reliable. We can trust the biblical record. It's not because archaeologists are out trying to prove the Bible. In fact, in many cases, archaeologists I know can be very skeptical people. They're not necessarily believers at all. And yet this objective discipline of archaeology has provided us with a wealth of evidence, which we're going to be looking at in our brief time this evening and then next week as well, a wealth of evidence that demonstrates that where the Bible can be tested, it fits with what we know of the ancient world. And drawing attention there to the picture of Jericho is helpful. Because look at the image on the screen. What a mess that looks. It's a hill that's been dug into and excavated for 80 or well, even 100 years. It's called the Holy Land, not because it's particularly holy, but because it's full of holes. And you can see, wow, in a picture like that, archaeologists have been excavating over the decades and turned it into a lunar landscape. But this is one of the reasons why this particular land is so important for archaeology. And all those people I've mentioned were concerned with the land of Israel or Canaan. Now think about this for a moment. This land, okay, I'm going to call it Canaan while we're in the Old Testament period. This land of Canaan is about the size of Wales. I've got nothing against Wales. I love Wales. But Wales has not been making the evening news for 3,000 years. But this land has. Why has it been so significant? Look at the screen again and the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia, down through to Egypt. This is the cradle of civilization. This is the landscape of the Sumerians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Hittites and so on. And where is Canaan in all of this land of the Bible? The land of the Bible is a very small tract of land, but it is the land bridge for 3 continents. For Africa and for Asia and for Europe, they all meet here. They all meet at this point. And therefore, all the armies and empires of the ancient world wanted to lay claim to this land of Canaan. At one point or another, they would all settle here and build here and fight here and have some kind of influence here and leave their mark here. And that means that from an archaeological point of view, if you excavate in any particular location in Israel, you're likely to find, I mean, in the modern day, if you excavate anywhere, you are likely to find artifacts and objects from most periods of human history. It's all there. I mean, whatever period you talk about, you'll find that certainly in terms of the Fertile Crescent and its surrounding landscape, you'll find objects and artifacts from those periods. And it's small. It's such a small landscape. So one of these sites you might dig, and one moment, I mean, I'll tell you in a location where I've been involved for a number of years in excavations, one moment you're discovering a piece of rusted metal that's probably Assyrian, and then the next moment you find a tube of Syrian toothpaste from the 1960s that was abandoned by soldiers when they used it as a bunker during the 1960s. So you can find all those kind of artifacts confused sometimes in the layers as a result of the centuries of occupation. And another key aspect is that this land is dominated by this particular feature. It's the tell. Now, tell, that's an Arabic word meaning a hill or a ruin. And this particular kind of hill, it's not a normal hill, it's a ruin, because if you look at this one, is a beautiful example. This is Beit Shan, and Beit Shan, or in the New Testament, it's Scythopolis. Okay, I might refer to it next week. In the Old Testament, it's called Beit Shan. It's occupied for over 1,000 years, and during that time, there have been many, many levels of occupation. What would basically happen is people would settle on a small hill thousands of years ago and build a settlement. And then because of war or an earthquake, that would be destroyed, and they'd build on top. And then they build on top, and then they build on top. And if you're looking at the screen now at Beit Shan, you'll see it's like a volcano rising into the air. And then to the left-hand side of it, you can see the period of the New Testament, because eventually it got too high, too unstable, and so they would have to build alongside. And so the New Testament town from the time of Jesus is a Roman period, and that's on the left-hand side. You can see back on ground level. But the large prominent hill there is 1,000 years of history. And if you took a spade and dug a hole in the side of it, you'd probably get arrested if you didn't have a permit. But if you dug a hole in the side, you'd be digging into a period of history from hundreds or thousands of years ago in this case. And this is only one of many tells. The landscape is littered with tells. It's because of the way that they built their fortified cities in Egypt, in Israel, in Syria, in the region, you know, when we move around the Fertile Crescent. We didn't build like this in ancient Britain. So, you know, if you were excavating in Britain, I was involved in a dig in the New Forest 2 summers ago. I was going to say last summer, but lockdown has meant I've hardly been out of the house. But, you know, the ground level of a Roman period house is the same ground level as our house today, because we've not had the layers of a tell that's been built up over the centuries. And so if you visit Israel today, you'll see tells everywhere. Megiddo, a very famous tell. You see, it's like, I don't know if you see this clearly on your screen, but this has been excavated, so the top has been taken off, and you've got there buildings and roads from the time of King Solomon and soon after. But it's a little bit like a pie slice, a cake slice on the left-hand side. And that slice is a slice of cake that exposes layers of history going back to the time of the Bronze Age and the period before the Israelites entered. And that means you have 20 different cities, one on top of the other at Megiddo, which would include the Israelite period and the period before. It's like a time capsule. And this is, of course, a playground for archaeologists. And there we are back at Jericho, or Tel Es Sultan, to use its modern name. And this particular tell, again, it's the longest, the oldest, I should say, the oldest continuously occupied city in the entire world. And so you have evidence of occupation for thousands of years, built one on top of the other, and demonstrating all sorts of aspects of not only human history, but also the history of our planet as a result of earthquakes and other geological changes. Now, what does this mean for us in terms of reading the Bible? You may have had people say to you, well, the Bible is myth or fairy tale or legend. But archaeology has demonstrated to us that what we read in the Bible fits with what we know of the ancient world. And even more than that, we find evidence directly for certain people and places and events from the Bible. So just one example, a few years ago, the Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a secular journal, it published an article on the Old Testament that said that 50 Old Testament personalities had been confirmed from outside of the Bible. And then within just a few months, there's an update, which is the web screenshot. Archaeology confirms 3 more Bible people. So at the moment, we could talk about 53 different Old Testament personalities that we know about, not just because we read about them in the Bible, but because we have archaeological evidence from outside of the Bible, from the relevant period or soon after, that demonstrates they are historical people. We've not got time to talk about 53, but I'm going to talk about a few of them with you, and that's not even touching the New Testament. So these are individuals that we know really existed. And I'm giving you these as an example. It's an example that shows when we open our Bibles in the Old Testament, we're not reading myth or legend or fairy tale. We're reading about real people who lived in real places, and there were real events that we have had confirmed from outside of the biblical record. So here we go. Just very quickly, some examples for you. Henry Layard, I mentioned at Nineveh, in his excavations, discovered the beautiful black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Now, this obelisk, which stands about 3 feet high, is in the British Museum today, and it has a number of registers, those panels, and each panel shows a different group of people coming to bring tribute to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. And this dates to about 825 BC, 825 BC, so we're talking nearly 3,000 years old. And beautifully carved in this black alabaster are the images of the different groups of people who bring their tribute to the Assyrian king. And in those registers, in one of the panels, there are 4 panels in total because they go all the way around the side of this obelisk, is a group of Israelites. And they're described as Israelites bringing their tribute to the Assyrian king. And bowing down is King Jehu, who we read about in the Bible. But do you see the text underneath the figures? It's like a little scratched lines, cuneiform it's called. And reading the cuneiform, we know this is a reference to King Jehu of the house of Omri. So he is bringing from the people of Judah a tribute to the Assyrian king. And so what you're looking at here is a photograph. It's the nearest thing to a photograph. It's an artist's impression, not only of an Israelite, but even of an Israelite king bringing his tribute to the Assyrian king. It might be his representative rather than the king himself, but you've got exquisite detail, not only a name of somebody we read about in the Bible, but their image and what they wore, what they looked like. And they do indeed look different from the Assyrian characters who are also inscribed on the black obelisk. Here's another remarkable find. This is from Tel Dan. Dan is in the north of Israel, and in excavations in 1993 and 1994, a discovery was made in one of the walls here at the entrance to the old Iron Age city of Dan, which was a real bombshell, I can tell you, in the world of biblical studies. Because in biblical studies, there can be a lot of skepticism about the Bible. And if there's one character in the Bible that people could be very skeptical of, it was the character of King David. Because King David seemed to be the stuff of legend. He's the kind of character that people invent when they want to have a story of a glorious past. It's like a King Arthur for the English. You'd have a King David for the people of Israel. So where is the evidence for King David, people claimed? We've got these stories in the Bible. We have the records in the Bible, but where's the account of King David from outside of the Bible? That's what we would want to find. And it was found. It was found in 1993, the first section of it. There are 2 sections, actually. It's called the Tel Dan inscription. And as the 2 sections go together, they're actually part of what was a smashed up stela. So if you remember the Meneptah stela I showed you, it would have once looked like that, you know, like a gravestone shape. It was smashed up sometime around 800 BC, sometime around 800 BC. And it was an inscription that had actually been put in the town of Dan, which is an Israelite town, by enemies of the Israelites, because at one point a neighboring people called the Arameans had conquered that town, the town of Dan, and they put up their own inscription. And the text there that you can see, it's called well, it's Aramean, it's the language of the Arameans, but the text is sometimes called the Phoenician alphabet. It's actually our alphabet, and it's also the Hebrew alphabet. So it's an early version of the Hebrew and indeed the alphabet that we still use to this day. And if you look at it, there's one little section that's in white on the photograph, and that's the direct reference to King David. It's the earliest reference to David outside of the Bible. So we're talking about 100 years after the time of David. And what's whited out there, that the text says the Beit David. And above it, the line above it says the Melech Israel, by the way. So what that means is, in white, Beit David means the house of David. It's like saying the dynasty of King David. And the line above, the Melech Israel, that's the King of Israel. The King of Israel. So originally, this standing stone probably made reference to 2 kings, actually. It probably gave the name of the northern king of Israel, as well as King David's house, the house of King David, the dynasty of King David, in the south, which would have been in Jerusalem. And this is enemy propaganda. It's Aramean, and it's been smashed to pieces, no doubt by the Israelites themselves, and it was used as fill in a wall. And that gives it a secure date, by the way. Nobody doubts the date of this. It's not a forgery, it's not a fake. It was found as part of the rubble, the kind of fill that was being used for a wall that had been built around 800 BC. And that means this dates to before the time of the wall. and it gives us a reference to David. It enforces the certainty we can have that when we read about David in the Bible, we are not reading of a legendary figure. We are not reading about a Robin Hood. We're not reading of a character from fantasy or fiction. We're reading about a real political figure from the ancient world. So, sorry, there is up large, by the way, the House of David reference, the Beit David. Well, let me give you another one before we go to questions, and we are going to go to questions in just a moment. I know my time is nearly done. We've already mentioned the Dome on the Rock, the beautiful Dome on the Rock that's been an Islamic shrine for 1400 years in the city of Jerusalem. And it's part of a platform which we call the Temple Mount, or the Noble Enclosure as it's called. And the Temple Mount platform is an astonishing place in terms of its history, because we have here a location which would take us right back to the time of Abraham and Mount Moriah and the binding of Isaac. And then as the centuries go by, this will be the location for Solomon's temple, and then Herod's great rebuilding of the temple, the time of Jesus. And then after that, after a brief period where a Roman temple stood here, then it becomes an Islamic holy place. So much history is here, and it speaks to us of this significant city for three major religions, but certainly for understanding biblical history. And here is the problem. You can't do archaeology here. In fact, I have to say, I've walked around on the Temple Mount numerous times, and sometimes I've had to hide the books I've been carrying, because if I'm seen to be carrying certain books, I will be told off by the authorities who look after the Temple Mount, because you're not even supposed to bring a book on it that uses the word archaeology or Temple Mount. So you've even got to be careful how you talk about it. And when I've taken groups up on it as well, what I want to show them are some of the unusual features which actually go right back potentially to the first temple period, actually, but certainly back to the Herodian period. And those are the features that interest me, and you've kind of got to be a little careful sometimes of what you're looking at and what you're taking photographs of as you wander around. It's very tense. But that hasn't stopped archaeology from working in and around the environs. And it's on the southern end of the Temple Mount and near to the Western Wall, you may know it as the Wailing Wall, very important to Judaism. Discoveries have been made that have opened up the period both of the time of Jesus and the Old Testament. And you're looking on the screen now at a bulla that was found just a few years ago. In fact, there are two bullas on the screen. I'll talk about both of them just briefly. What is a bulla, you may be asking? It's about the size of your thumb, and it's the impression left in clay by a very small seal, a little stone that's been carved, sometimes with a name or a place or some inscription, and it's stamped in clay. And if the clay happens to be maybe baked in fire, maybe if a city is destroyed in fire, it can bake very hard and survive for thousands of years. And these are a couple of clay impressions that were found in Israel. And the left-hand side, the one on the left-hand side, bears the name of King Hezekiah. It's Hezekiah's personal seal, the king of Judah. This is the 8th century king, and it has an icon. It's actually an Egyptian icon that he uses. I could tell you more about that later if you're interested, but it's Hezekiah's personal seal. We have seen them before. It's not the first one to have ever been found, because they've appeared on the black market, and they appear on jar handles as well. This is the first one to be found on an archaeological dig, though, and relatively recently. I'll just show you on the screen where it was found. You've got the Temple Mount there again on the screen. You can just about see the Dome on the Rock disappearing into the distance there. And then there's a little red arrow pointing to where, well, this is giving the game away. This is what I was going to get to. I've given it away with the slide. It's pointing to where the Isaiah seal was found. Now, what that red arrow is really pointing to is where a whole batch of seals were found. About 30 of them were found all together. All of them date to the time of King Hezekiah, and they include this stunning, beautiful one, the Hezekiah seal. But also found with it is a broken seal, and that's the one on the right-hand side. The top half is broken off. Of this bulla. I should call it a bulla rather than a seal, because the seal is the original stone that's stamped, and the seal is the clay impression left behind. And the broken one on the right-hand side is another really interesting one. I mean, the Hezekiah one is really, I mean, that's very significant. It's complete, and it's a king from Jerusalem. But the one on the right-hand side bears the name of Isaiah. It has the name of Isaiah and 3 Hebrew letters, which would be the word Navi. And that's the Hebrew word for prophet. Now, Elliot Matsar, who found this, given the wording and the location and the dating where it's found, has identified it as the bula, the impression left behind of the seal of Isaiah the prophet. Given that it was found so close to Hezekiah's seal, the dating is secure. It's an Isaiah from the time of Hezekiah. In the Bible, we read that Isaiah the prophet was a sort of advisor to King Hezekiah. However, it is broken. And that's what I kind of want to just finish with this one as an artifact, just to make this point. That therefore, we can't be 100% sure on this one. Personally, I think there's good evidence to say this really was the bula left behind, the impression of Isaiah the prophet. But because it's broken, we don't know what the whole of the bula may have said. Also, it's an unusual one. Normally, you wouldn't have Navi as that word prophet stamped on a seal. That does sound unusual. So some people think it might be part of a name or something. So you can't be sure because it's broken. And that's why when I said there are 53 people that we know about from the archaeological record that we read about in the Bible, that's the 53 ones that are confirmed, that there's not really any debate about. We've also got a vast number that are, we can't be absolutely sure. And that's where the Isaiah example would come in. That wouldn't be one of the 53. That would be a good example of where archaeology, year upon year upon year, produces more and more material. Some we can be very sure of its meaning. Others, it's open to debate. You can question it. But what we can say very confidently from this material is that as the years go by, we have more and more evidence that confirms the book that we hold and read, the Bible, is rooted in real history, real places, and real people. And so as we go to questions, and hopefully you've got some questions, let's finish with the Bible verse from the New Testament that we're going on to next week, because we'll look at the Gospels next week. In 2 Peter 1, verse 16, Peter wanted to make it very clear to the first followers of Jesus, we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. That's Peter speaking of his friend Jesus. But we could say of the whole biblical record from Genesis to Revelation, we're not following cleverly devised stories when we tell you of the message of the Bible. There were eyewitnesses, and the world of archaeology has been serving to help confirm the reliability of that message. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. And I'm very happy, Becca, to hand back to you, I think. Is that right?
Oh, thanks, Chris. That was amazing. I have been a proper teacher and made lots of notes, so thank you so much. We're going to dive straight into some questions, if that's okay. Thank you so much to people who have been putting them on Facebook and YouTube. We can see them there. Please keep your questions coming. We will go for about, we'll see how long we go for, but yeah, please keep them coming. So, Chris, the first one is from Becky. She said, how did archaeologists decipher hieroglyphics without any ancient Egyptians to translate it for them?
Brilliant question. And it's a fantastic story, by the way, the story of their decipherment. The key to it all was a French man, Champollion, because a French man was working on a discovery that another French man, Napoleon, had made in Egypt. When Napoleon went to Egypt in the late 1700s, he took with him lots of scholars, and they discovered something called the Rosetta Stone. You can see it in the British Museum to this day. It's another stela, so another one of these gravestone shapes. And on the Rosetta Stone was an inscription in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Very beautiful, very detailed. But it's a trilingual message. In other words, it's got a message in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and in the middle, it had a message in another script that nobody knew. It's called Demotic Egyptian, but nobody knew that at the time. And then a third message underneath in classical Greek. Now, it was the same message in 3 different scripts. And it was a man called Champollion in France who had, ironically, by the way, the story of the Rosetta Stone is that Napoleon was defeated, of course, at an important battle in Egypt. And so we took the Rosetta Stone back to London. So it's been in the British Museum ever since. But the French got the last laugh because they were the first to actually decipher the Rosetta Stone. And it's really the key to it was the fact that they could read the Greek. I mean, it's the same as the Greek in the New Testament, practically. So you can pretty well read the Greek, and they knew it was a coronation decree or coronation message of Pharaoh, one of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy IV, around 200 BC. So they could read all of that. And then they could begin to decipher the message in Egyptian hieroglyphics to see how it worked. Once they'd done that, they could compare it with lots of other inscriptions. There were a few others that had this kind of feature. In fact, there's one, funnily enough, there's one near us in Wimborne, actually. There's a needle in Wimborne, which has got a bilingual message in Egyptian hieroglyphics. So they could do the comparison, and that's really the key to unlocking it, Becca.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's cool that you got it at Wimborne. That's fun. Thank you. Perfect. So Becky also asks, how deep do you have to dig to find somewhere like Jericho? So how deep would you have to dig?
Great. Look, it's a great question, because when we say Jericho, or you say any city, right, Jerusalem, whatever, when you say a city, the problem is, what year are you talking about? What period are you talking about? Because after all, places change names over time. So in other words, you'll have a top level that you could still say is Jericho, but that may not be the Jericho that you're interested in the Bible. You may have to dig down to get to that layer of Jericho. And if you dig on down further, you might find another layer of a previous city with a different name. I mean, Jericho, for example, is a tell, and you've got many levels, because it's such a long-lasting city. So many levels. And most of those levels, we know nothing about them. We don't know what they were called. We don't know much about who lived there. We don't know what they thought. We don't know. So the Jericho level itself, you do have to dig down a pretty significant way. So it just happens at that tell, got reoccupied and rebuilt over many centuries. So you have to dig down. Okay, off the top of my head, depends what section of the tell, but you're going to be digging down 20 foot to get to the level of the biblical period. If you visit Jerusalem, I mean, Jerusalem's a great example of this, where at some places in Jerusalem, you can be walking at the same level as the Old Testament period. And at other places, you may even see a little glass partition or a section that you can look down, and about 20 foot below you, you can see the street where Jesus walked. Do you see what I mean? So the levels vary depending on where you are.
Mm. Oh, amazing. Thank you. That's a cool thing to see. Andy asks, where can we find a list of these 53 individuals, the ones that you mentioned, and some information about the relevant archaeology, please?
Great. Well, that's an easily accessible article. So all you need to do as a search is the Biblical Archaeology, the Biblical Archaeological Review, which is a BAR. And if you just type in BAR 53 or 50 personalities, you'll get a link to the article by a scholar called Lawrence Mayanchenk, who's not a Christian, by the way. I mean, it's not an article written to defend the Bible particularly. It's just a scholarly article on what names we know from outside the Bible. The original article, like I say, is 50, and then there was a supplement a little while later, another 3. And as the years go by, more is emerging all the time.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Perfect. Great. So Abigail asks, and I know that Paul and Nia talk about something similar. What is your opinion about the Exodus, where there is no Egyptian textual evidence to suggest a mass migration ever occurred?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the evidence for the Exodus, the first thing to say is, the further back you go in history, it's true that generally the harder it gets. So it is true, the further back you go, evidence for it doesn't matter what you're talking about, for anything, it can become much more fragmentary. Now, in terms of the story of the Exodus, we've got to ask ourselves, what would we be looking for in terms of the Egyptian records? What are the Egyptians recording? The Egyptians are recording, like that Meneptah stela I showed you, they're recording propaganda. They are not writing down all their failings and all their failures. They're writing down victories and successes, certainly in monumental architecture anyway. So the Egyptians would not have recorded the loss of slaves. They would certainly not have recorded how their Egyptian war machine was defeated in the Red Sea as a result of trying to chase runaway slaves. They wouldn't record things like that. In fact, there's a lot of things we know about Egyptian history because of attempts to erase things. We piece it together. And we know an awful lot about Egyptian history that they tried to erase. So, for example, there's a king list in the British Museum that's got a list of the different Egyptian kings down to the time of King Ramesses II in the 13th century. And it deliberately erases kings they didn't want to remember anymore. They were embarrassed about. For example, females. At the time of Ramesses II, they didn't like women pharaohs anymore. They became anti-women pharaohs, so they ignored any women pharaohs. So there was no mention of any female rulers. And there was also a period in Egyptian history in the 15th century BC when there was an attempt to impose the worship of one god in Egypt, called the Amarna heresy. And again, any pharaoh associated with the Amarna heresy, like Akhenaten, they erase him from the record. There's no mention of him. It's like just gone. So Egyptians didn't record that kind of thing. What we do find, however, is good evidence for. I mean, sorry, Abigail, you put on there mass migration. I mean, that's a neat way of putting it, because there is good evidence for mass migration. What you have from Egypt is good evidence for, first of all, Semitic settlers in Egypt helping with the brick building business. So we know it fits with the relevant period of biblical history, period we call the sojourn. And we've got evidence of Semitic, and they're called Semitic not by me because I read the Bible. They're called Semitic by the scholars. That's the term that's used. The culture is Semitic. It's the Semitic culture from Canaan. So there are Semitic settlers. They're in Egypt at the time. You could search up the Beni Hassan tomb scene to see an image of them coming in from Canaan to settle in the land of Egypt. They are at first welcome, but then they become unwelcome. And eventually you do have a mass migration to Canaan. Generally dated to around the 13th century BC. Personally, I'll go with an exodus around the 15th century BC. But regardless, it's in a kind of 200-year period. You get some kind of mass migration, and a new culture arrives in Canaan from the outside, and there are new cities that are being, cities are being rebuilt, and new settlements are appearing in the land of Israel around the time of the Merneptah Stela, actually, which would be another piece of evidence we referred to. So that's the kind of material we talk about for the Exodus. What we're not talking about here, and I know some Christians get very disappointed with this, but we're not talking about an Egyptian record that says, hey, Moses took 600,000 Israelites out of the land and and be gone with them. You don't get a reference like that. So probably, I mean, sorry, Becca, I could say a lot more on this topic, but that's probably as short as I can make an answer.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That's I didn't realize that they erased things in history. So that's an interesting point. I like that.
Yes.
So Malcolm asks, what are some discoveries that you would like to be made? Either people, places, or events mentioned in the Bible. What would you like to be discovered?
Oh, wow. What a question. I bring it on, everything. I suppose a key personality that I do think we should find something for is Solomon. And Solomon is an issue because Solomon is the glory days, for ancient Israel. It's the united monarchy. It's the great period of peace and prosperity. Mind you, if you read between the lines, it's not quite as peaceful and prosperous as you might think. The Bible is very, very honest. It's one of the striking things about the Bible, by the way, compared to ancient Near Eastern literature. The Bible is not propaganda. It draws attention to the failings and the problems and the weaknesses. David's adultery with Bathsheba. Solomon got up some terrible things. And, but apart from the moral terrible things, the other thing that Solomon did, we read about if you read between the lines, is he sold off loads of bits of Israel to the Phoenicians because he got into debt. Solomon was spending loads of money on building projects, but he was also getting the land heavily into debt. And that's partly why it fell apart after he died. There's a great split because they'd run out of money. They were heavily in debt and the taxes had gone up. And what that means is that Solomon's, the peace and prosperity of Solomon's period is actually more complicated than we sometimes think it is. And we don't have a direct reference to Solomon outside of the Bible. There is a little seal that bears the name of Solomon, which some think is King Solomon's seal. Most scholars don't think so, though. Most scholars don't think it's authentic. So I won't include it. It's not part of the 53. But apart from that, we really don't have anything. And yet we can't. I would hope that we will find that at some point, because we should. And I think if you're really asking me what we should find, the thing, this is it, right, Becca? The thing archaeologists really, really love is not the gold, shiny stuff. The thing that makes archaeologists dance on a dig is not the gold and the silver and the jewelry and the shiny stuff. It's literary documents, text, textual information. So it might be a broken fragment of a tablet with a bit of cuneiform on it. That's information that gets you into people's heads. You start to think about what they thought. And a cuneiform library is what we would really like to find in the land of Israel. There must be one. There's a particular site called Hatzor, which is in Galilee in the north. And at Hatzor, all the signs are there. There should be a library there somewhere. Not been found, but there should be. The location I've been involved in, again, there was a palace. There was an important Old Testament period palace. There should be a library. Nothing's been found yet. But a library, that would be the great thing. They've been found elsewhere in the Fertile Crescent. There's important libraries from Syria and Assyria, if you go over into Iraq. So they've found libraries and palaces, 3,000-year-old libraries. Wouldn't that be amazing, right? A library from 3,000 years ago in the land of Israel. That would be the great thing. Yeah.
This is my personal question, sorry, to add on to that. So if you were to go out to and to go look for that, is there like particular technology that you could use to see if there's kind of like something underneath the ground? Like, how would you go about doing that?
Yes, I mean, there's lots and lots of technology involved now. Nothing really beats digging a hole, though. So, obviously there is ground penetrating radar and so on that's used. The kind of stuff we're talking about, though, that's pretty ambiguous in terms of that sort of technology, because a cuneiform tablet is no different than a lump of clay. That's really what it is, a lump of clay. So, and that's no different than pottery. So in terms of a site, really you've got to get a spade. That's the only way. And it's the thing about archaeology, and this is world over, but certainly in Israel, it's a very scientific, carefully controlled discipline. You don't just grab a shovel and get an EasyJet flight out there and start digging a hole. And that means it's painstakingly slow, because you don't want to spoil anything or damage anything. If you're interested in what I've been up to, if you look up my name on Facebook, you'll see I've got a Facebook page, not my sort of personal page of holiday photos, but I've got a public page of like some of the archaeology, and you'll see me on. I do little videos of things. There's one video of me coming out of a tunnel, and it's only 3 minutes. Literally, it's a tunnel that opened up under a palace, 3,000-year-old tunnel near the Sea of Galilee. And I come up out of this tunnel and just say a few things, and I talk to the person who's looking after it. It was only just found. We don't know what that tunnel is. We do not know where it goes or where it leads. And literally 2 days after that video was recorded, there was a rock fall inside the tunnel, caused an injury, and nothing's been done to it since. We don't know what it is. And that's the kind of thing where it's very careful, because it's quite dangerous, actually. That sort of thing, dangerous. And who knows what that tunnel is? I mean, I've got some ideas, but we don't really know. It could be an escape tunnel. It could be a passage to a library. It might be a tomb. It's under a palace. It goes under a palace from 3,000 years ago.
Wow! Oh, great! Thank you. Yeah, that's a cool thing to do. So John says, have there been any positive discoveries that you found particularly troubling for your belief in the Bible's historicity?
Again, it's a really good question, and I mean, I get asked that sometimes, and I am sort of genuinely sort of stumped by it, because I want to say yes in a way, because I want to say there are these things that trouble me and so on. But I genuinely can't say that. I mean, there's certainly, these are the problems, right? Number one would be a lack of evidence. So there are some things we just don't have evidence for. Why is the evidence not there? Now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's a principle in archaeology. So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact we haven't found a Solomon record doesn't mean there's no King Solomon. But nonetheless, I mean, I think that's one to put out there, is that you might want there to be more, and that could be troubling. The other thing, though, and this is kind of like, this doesn't keep me awake at night, this answer to the question. There are things in archaeology that challenge my reading of the Bible. And for me, that's helpful. I like that. I like the fact that I have to reread the Bible. I think actually maybe it's not quite the way I envisaged it in the videos I used to watch, or the Sunday school storybooks I used to see that showed it displayed in one particular way. So it challenges my way of reading the Bible. Now, I don't find that's not like a faith upsetting thing where I'm awake at night wondering whether the Lord exists. What it is it makes me read the Bible as real history, and I have to start thinking, what really happened here? What does it really look like? I could give you examples of that. I don't know, Becca, whether
I think that'd be. I think that'd be good.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example, and this might be controversial, by the way, to people watching. So that's fine. You can send your questions in, and somebody else will pick up on those. But here's one. So we're told in the Exodus that 600,000 male fighting men leave the land of Egypt. Now that would mean that probably if you add in the women and the children, you'd get to a number like 2 million. you'd have about 2 million. Because if it's 600,000 fighting men, you've got to have the women and children. So you're going to have about 2 million Israelites leaving Egypt and going into the Holy Land. And I used to think, well, look, if I'm going to take the Bible seriously, that's what it says. That's what it is. Now, the archaeology makes that just utterly implausible. Okay, utterly implausible. It's not tenable. I mean, for example, that's more than the population of Egypt. I mean, this is a vast number. Take the city of Jericho we've been talking about. Jericho, as a sealed city, has a population of 2,000 tops. You know, that's the sort of population. A big town in the land of Canaan, if you really pack everybody in, you might be able to fit 40,000 in a squeeze. I mean, that wouldn't be normal. That would be a squeeze. These places are very, very small. And so when you start to multiply the issues involved in trying to calculate 2 million, where they would have come from, where they would have gone, just doesn't fit the record. Now, that challenged me, and this is my resolution to it, is that actually the Hebrew word for 1,000 is the word Eleph. And the Hebrew word Eleph means a unit. It's like a fighting unit. It doesn't have to mean 1,000 literal people. So when we read about 600,000 fighting men, 600,000 people, in Hebrew, we're talking about 600 Elephs, 600 units. Now that suddenly all starts to begin to make sense there, because you've got 600 units. It's a military calculation in Exodus. It's 600 units of fighting men plus whoever else. And then when they get across the River Jordan, it uses a number like 40,000, which may be the total population number. 40,000 sounds more like the population number. 600 units is how they divided themselves up for fighting. Now, do you see what I mean there, Becca? That's my way of thinking through, how do I read the Bible in the light of the archaeology? Now, it may be that some people listening are saying, oh, no, you're being loose with the text now. You know, you shouldn't be doing that. But for me, I'm quite positive about that way of reading the Bible. It doesn't trouble my faith. It brings it alive. It makes it even more interesting. I can visualize it now. I can see where these things would have happened, how it would have worked. I can visualize the numbers in relation to the city of Jericho when they were walking around the walls of Jericho. So that kind of thing is a good example, John, answering your question, I think, of the sort of thing that challenges my reading the Bible.
Oh, thank you. That's really, really interesting. So we've still got a few more. We'll keep going. So Jasmine says, did you get caught up carrying books? I assume this was talking about when you're walking around.
It's always been okay. I have been a bit careless sometimes. I mean, there's some fantastic books, like there's one by an archaeologist called Lean Rittmeyer, which is an extensive overview of the Temple Mount. It goes brick by brick into the significance of every square inch of the Temple Mount, you know, who put what, where and how. It's a brilliant book. He's an archaeologist and an architect, so he brings those two professional fields together. And the trouble is, you really need it there in front of you when you're walking around the Temple Mount to see what he's talking about. And yet, you know, I've not been caught out myself, but I've been fairly casual sometimes, and that's been risky. I mean, you're not allowed to carry religious books on the Temple Mount, so Bible, Torah, anything like that. You have to leave them outside. You're not allowed on with those in hand. So that's the kind of thing I'll be careful about. I mean, I'm sure others have probably been out to Israel who are watching this who've made mistakes and carried, I don't know, they bought a menorah candlestick at the local market and then carried it onto the Temple Mount and got told off. If you're a Western tourist, it's not really a problem. You just say sorry and it's all right. But they can be very suspicious, and they don't like archaeologists. So one of the great archaeologists actually in Jerusalem, who's very significant in terms of the Temple Mount area, has been excavating around the Temple Mount. He was forcibly removed. He was walking on the Temple Mount, showing some people some of the archaeology, and was forcibly removed. I think it was only summer before last.
Wow. Okay.
So there's a lot of tension in Jerusalem. You may have heard from time to time that there are religious tensions around the city of Jerusalem, and that includes the archaeology. The archaeology is very tense. If you Google the Pilgrims Road, which is a brand new underground tunnel that's been excavated, it's the road that was from the time of Jesus that leads from the Pool of Siloam up to the temple. Fantastic bit of excavation going on. Very, very tense though, because a lot of people don't like it. Because it's evidence of the Jewish presence in the land, and that upsets people. Some people, I mean.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, absolutely. We're just Liz just said, what was the book again that you just mentioned about the Temple of the Mount?
Yeah, Ritmay, that's right. I think you've pretty well got it there. No, it was Lean, Leen, N on the end there, Lean Ritmay. The particular one I was referring to is called The Quest. So if you tap up The Quest, you'll get that's the hardback large volume. But you can get smaller versions, things like, I think he's written books like Jerusalem in the First Century or something. The other thing Lean Ritmay has done, which you might like, if I'm not talking about the Bible translation, but the ESV Bible translation has a study Bible and a Bible atlas to go with it, and they use his illustrations, and they're fantastic because they're not just like pretty pictures; they're archaeologically rigorous. So they look at what we know of the landscape for the pictures he draws.
Oh, thank you. That's amazing. Okay, Neil says, how accurate in terms of location of the event is the Church of the Nativity and the Church of the Holy
Sepulchre?
That's the one. I can pronounce that. Sorry.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I mean, all these things get debated, Neil, as you'll know. So there are different opinions out there. But as you're asking me, my opinion is they are there's strong reasons to think they're authentic. The sites are authentic. So I mean, there's a number of reasons. One of them is to do with tradition. Tradition's not always a bad thing, right? Early Christians would have retained traditions. They would have remembered certain things. The Bethlehem one is certainly a cave from the first century in a collection of caves that were in use. If you ever visit Bethlehem or have visited Bethlehem, I always recommend to people, don't worry about the Church of Nativity. Go next door, the Church of St. George, and go in the tunnel underneath, down the stairway in the church next door. If you do that, you'll enter into another cave system from the same period. It's where Jerome was when he translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century. And there's a little pinhole that you can look through, and you'll be able to see the actual cave in the Church Nativity as well. Oh. And what it shows is these are caves that were occupied at that time. Now, whether it's the actual cave that Jesus was born in, who knows? But the traditions were good when Helena had the church built. Certainly the church goes back to the 4th century, very early. Now, Church of the Holy Sepulchre is even stronger, much, much stronger. And I think the evidence is just very, very strong for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Much as I don't like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, by the way, I'll probably talk about it next week, actually. So maybe I won't say much more now, but I think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has got good, authentic reasons for thinking it is the right location, despite how many of us as Christians find it a very difficult church to visit because we don't really like the noise and the chaos and the smells and the priests who fight with each other sometimes. It's a strange place.
Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Thank you. Okay, so Nia says, I have seen documentaries or websites where people have claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant as possibly Noah's Ark, among other things. Are these genuine finds?
Okay, generally not. Okay, for some reason, to get a documentary with a high YouTube rating, you generally have to use the bogus material. So, because I guess it just gets the clicks, doesn't it? So, yeah, you've got Noah's Ark and Ark of the Covenant. I believe in Noah's Ark and I believe in the Ark of the Covenant, but I do not believe they've been found. So, all that I've seen have been bogus. And yeah, I mean, the Noah's Ark ones, there's a number of Noah's Ark ones, and none of them bear scrutiny. The Ark of the Covenant, there's a number of those. If you want to Google search again, I did write an article on the Ark of the Covenant for Christianity Magazine last year. So if you just put in my name in Ark of the Covenant, it'll probably come up on a Google search. And I explain my reasons there why I don't think the Ark of the Covenant actually will ever be found. I mean, there's a biblical reason for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll make sure to have a look. Amy asks, how long have you been studying the Bible? How long have you been studying the Bible? Okay, Amy. I mean, the way it worked for me is that I was brought up going to church. So, as a child, I went to church. And for me, church was tradition, utterly boring. And the Bible was the dullest book on earth. So I would have no interest in reading it. I lost interest in church when I was a teenager and drifted away, so I had less interest in it until I met people who called themselves Christians, which I thought was kind of odd that people would call themselves Christians. What does that really mean? And I discovered they had a personal faith in Christ, which then meant something to me because I became a Christian. And at that point, the Bible really came alive to me. And I would say in terms of studying the Bible, there's a big difference, right, between sort of like knowing the Bible or even hearing the Bible and actually being captivated by the Bible. And, as a young believer, so I'd only been a believer a few months, I went to a little church in Southampton called Portswood Church.
and there was this pastor there, and I'd never heard anything like this before. Right? There was this pastor there called John Simmons, who would preach the Bible like it was the most interesting thing on earth, and like it was relevant to the whole of life, and it blew me away, you know. And I would say I fell in love with the Bible. I got an opportunity to preach at a church near Southampton when I was about, I don't know, 18, 19. I was probably too young to be let loose, but I had an opportunity, and I just absolutely loved. I mean, the sermon was probably terrible that I did, but I loved studying and preparing for the sermon. I got so much more out of it than anybody else would have done. And so ever since then, I mean, I loved studying the Bible, and I enjoy reading the Bible. I suppose the question you're asking really then is, how old am I? Because I've said that, so it's got to be about 30 odd years.
Amazing. I mean, John Simmons still does the same thing. It's really wonderful. So nothing's changed. It's amazing. All right, we've got a couple more questions, and then we will wrap up. So Becky asks, what books would you recommend for the average Joe interested in archaeological, historical aspects of the Bible?
Great. There's a really good book, because I'm teaching from home here with you. I've got stuff here actually. Let me show you. Let me show you something. If you want one intro to this subject, this is a good one. Day one, Evidence for the Bible by Clive Anderson and Brian Edwards. It's a really nice, glossy, full color book that just gives you lots of the kind of finds and so on from history. It's a really good one, that one, Evidence for the Bible. The other one I was just going to show you, because it's here somewhere, is oh, here it is. Yeah, got it here. If you want to go into a bit more detail, scholarly book, Jody Magnus, The Archaeology of the Holy Land. So that's the one which is going to be more of a kind of like scholarly kind of work. It's not sensationalizing things, but it's rigorous, and it's really useful. Picture of Petra on the front, by the way, which is in modern day Jordan. And then you might want to another one that's useful like this. Clyde Fant and Mitchell Reddish, Lost Treasures of the Bible. It's a relatively recent one. Gives you an overview of the artifacts, but the pictures are in black and white. This one, by the way, that one I showed you, the Evidence for the Bible hardback. This is the full hardback version. They produced for prisons. All the prisons in the UK got free copies of a mini version of it in full glossy colour. It's only tiny. And I really recommend this as something to get hold of, to stick in your car or a place of work whenever we get out of lockdown, and have it there to show people or pass on to people. Because if people say to you, how do you know the Bible's not myth or legend? This is the kind of thing you just want to be able to flick. It's only really a little booklet. You want to just flick through and say, these are the kind of reasons like these. So it's a mini version. You can get hold of it. It's only about £1 or something. And it's a great little booklet to have. It's reliable, good information.
Amazing. What we might do is maybe we'll get the list of those things, and we'll either put them on the chat today or next week we'll put them on the chat.
Becca, I forgot to mention my book.
Oh gosh, go quick.
This is why I'd be hopeless as a salesperson. I wrote a book called Time Travel to the Old Testament by IVP. So if you're interested in that, I put in there lots of the information on not just on the archaeology, but on the kind of climate and the geology and the kind of the area of the Holy Land and what that means for how we read our Old Testaments. So sorry, I just got that one in.
Yeah, well, we definitely want to recommend that one. Nia said, can someone send us an email with all the books mentioned? Yes, Nia, we'll look into either when we send the link next week, making sure those are there, or we'll make sure to put all those links in the chat next week, including Chris's book. So we'll make sure that that's all there. Amazing. So I think we're approaching 9 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap up. Chris, has been loads of comments just saying, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. I've really, really enjoyed it. And other people talking about their dicey moments on the Temple of the Mount. So that's great. But thank you so much for our time together. And Malcolm has also said, please, could you show us your book next week? So we'll maybe in the question and answers next week, we can have a look at your book too. That'd be really excellent. Great. Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up there. It's been so great. Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us today, and for everybody joining along. We really hope you enjoyed it. Please keep sharing the link because people can view this afterwards, which is fantastic. And please tell your friends, and we can't wait to see you next week. Have a lovely week, and we'll see you next Thursday. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.